am Gabriella Crocco. I am here in charge of the program Interdisciplinary Explorations of the Institute of Advanced Studies of Aix-Marseille. So I want just to say welcome to this public session of the International Workshop on Trial for Psychedelic Substance, organized by Dr. Michael Kozlowski, which is psychiatrist at the Hospital Charité of Berlin, and IMERA Fellows for 10 months here. Just to say some word about the place, this is a university-based Institute of Advanced Studies. Our purpose is essentially to welcome foreign researchers, foreign fellows selected for residencies of 10 or 5 months on the basis of their research program, on the interest of this research program for our activity in the Institute. In particular, Michael Kozlowski has greatly participated of one of the activities of the interdisciplinary exploration program on mental health, which is a workshop that we do once a month with psychiatrists, psychology therapists, and all the other people interested in this subjects. And I just put that a paper for mailing list of people from here, from Marseille, that could be interested to participate to these workshops. So it's just a great success for us to have helped one of our residents organize such an important moment of exchange between different international and national research group on the psychedelic renaissance in psychiatric therapy. And today is important for us because it's Marseille and France. It is important for us just to make the point, what is the situation now in France? What is France in respect to these trials, and what we can develop here and in Europe. So again, welcome to it. Thank you for your participation, and I think I leave to make all the presentation of the different participants to this first presentation, and then table ronde. During the table ronde, we have exchange with the public on questions and all that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gabriella. I'm so grateful to be here, and this is thanks to IMERA, thanks to you, thanks to some other people in this room. And I had this idea like 1 year ago, together with some other people, with Arnaud. Where are you, Arnaud? There. To set up this workshop to bring together German researchers and psychiatrists, psychologists that have just begun to do clinical research on psychedelics, and French colleagues that are engaged in this field and they want to participate and to plan their own trials. So I'm very, very happy that you all found your way here, and I see some familiar faces from Marseille, because there's also a bigger interest. We're doing this 2-day workshop, today and tomorrow, with a limited amount of people. So we are 25 colleagues here that work together on protocols and trial planning. But it was important for us to also offer, to give a public presentation of where we are standing, and to discuss with you and other colleagues from Marseille that have come tonight, about this very innovative and also controversial new therapy form with psychedelics. And I have to remind myself sometimes that it's still they are part of the Schedule 1 substances. That means the stupéfiants. So in the class of the most dangerous substances. And so yeah, this always plays a part in our considerations. So I'm very happy to announce the talk of Vincent Verhulst. Vincent, he is a doctorate in a PhD, a candidate in historian, affiliated with the University of Amiens, and is part in many activities in this field, and founder of the Société Psychédéliques Française. And he works together with trial groups in Paris to set up the first trials. And yeah, so I'm very happy to hear your talk.
Thank you very much, Michael. Hello, everyone. Thank you to Gabriela Korkup and Mikhail Kozlowski for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here in Marseille. So the title of my presentation is Medical Use of Psychedelics in France. What can we learn from history for the future? And it was you, Michael, who suggested this title to me. So I'm going to take it as an inspiration. More precisely, I'm working in history of science on the discovery of psilocybine mushrooms in France and on the first experiments with psilocybine in hospitals in the late 50s and early 60s. The problem is that, as I understand the history of the first experiments with psilocybine in hospital, the therapeutic experiments did not work particularly well and were abandoned relatively quickly. And a few years before the prohibition of psychedelics and the moral panic linked to the concern about the alleged use of these drugs in the innocent youth in the second half of the 60s. So the narrative which claims that blind and mindless prohibition prevented the development of psychedelic therapies does not work in the case of France. So clinical trials stopped before the prohibitions of psychedelics, which happened as early in 1966 in France. This is probably a good question to ask. Why did the trial stop in this case? I said that the psilocybine trials in hospitals in France did not work well, and indeed, when you read Anne-Marie Quétin's medical thesis on psilocybine in clinical and experimental psychiatry, defended in Paris in 1960, so quite early after the discovery of psilocybin molecule, when you read this thesis, you find that in the vast majority of cases, the improvement in the symptoms of a broad range of psychiatric disorders, the improvements occurred only during the effect of the drug or a few days after its administration. This improvement was not systematic, since Jean Delay's team at the Hôpital Sainte-Anne, which studied psilocybine as early as 1958, they observed an exacerbation of the symptoms of various conditions and concluded that the psilocybin treatment was of diagnostic interest. There were some spectacular therapeutic successes, however, such as that of an anorexic and depressive patient in whom Professor Jean Delay's team concluded that psilocybine was unquestionably effective. If you are interested in this case study of an anorexic patient, I have translated and presented it with Meg Briggs and Ryan Zaffar of the Imperial College London in a paper published in 1921. But these spectacular recoveries are still very rare and are more a matter of happy accidents than a general rule. With historians Zoé Dubus and Élise Grandgeorges, we have an article analyzing the history of the administration of psychedelics in France, which will soon be published in Frontiers in Psychology, and which shows that French researchers have not measured the importance of psychological preparation and of the context, no doubt because of an intellectual isolationism with regards to North American researchers in particular, where the set and setting have been taken into account. I also refer you to the work of Zoé Dubus on the medical history of LSD in France, and to her recently defended thesis, which shows that French doctors did not take into account the set and the setting. This is also true for psilocybin, and the study of experimental protocols with the substance in France at the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 60s shows that not only there no real preparation of the patients or any particular efforts on the setting were made, but also that the doses used were relatively low, around 10 milligrams, with a dose of 15 milligrams considered not to be exceeded. From a methodological point of view, French doctors proceeded by trial and errors and were strongly marked by empiricism. So to answer the question in the title, perhaps we could already say that to avoid the mistakes of the past, we must break with a certain intellectual isolationism in France, which prevented French researchers from learning how to use substances from their foreign colleagues who had more interesting results. This is why I can only welcome this international meeting organized by Mikhail Kozlovsky. So to conclude, before going any further, I would also like to propose the hypothesis that the rapid abandonment of psychedelics in France is also due to the success of neuroleptics, which are much easier to administer than psychedelics and whose calming virtues on agitated patients quickly won over clinicians. If I am to believe Jean-Noël Lissa's work on the history of biological psychiatry. And this is at the same time as experiments on psychedelics were being carried out. I mean, the success of neuroleptics and largactil, chlorpromazine. But it is now time for the return of psychedelics, as we all know. And in this respect, I wanted to share with you some video clips from a very old French documentary movie that I found again, showing two healthy volunteers who took mushrooms for science in 1959. The first clip shows Madame Barrault, filmed as part of this scientific documentary on the hallucinogenic mushrooms of Mexico, made under the direction, scientific supervision of Professor Roger Ames, a mycologist who identified and named the species discovered in Mexico from 1953. Within the framework of this documentary, which presents also the biogeographical, ethnological, archaeological, chemical aspects of the sacred mushrooms of Mexico, there is also a psychological part, but enough talk. I'll start the first clip. What I find particularly interesting here is the feeling of affection that arises between Miss Barrault and the microphone. If she was in the outdoors and she developed a feeling of attachment with a tree or a flower, I don't know, don't you think we would risk concluding that it was psychedelic-induced biophilia? You know, a feeling of being connected to nature, which has been observed in some trials. Here, our volunteer feels connected to this inert object that is next to her. I wonder if psilocybin could not be said to have a prosocial behavior towards anything, and maybe kind of a ontology shifting effect, as if this substance could provoke a kind of animism, at least momentarily. In any case, these volunteers' attachment to a microphone should make us relativize perhaps the relevance of the psychedelic-induced biophilia theory, maybe. There is maybe a connection with the study by Chris Timmerman and colleagues that suggested in Nature that psychedelics alter metaphysical beliefs. Results reveals significant shifts away from physicalist or materialist views and towards panpsychism, the belief that consciousness is everywhere after use. It seems to me that this kind of alteration of the person should be subject of an ethical reflection and perhaps more broadly of a reflection on a social psychopharmacology and even perhaps a moral psychopharmacology. But let's move on to a second video extract, if you will. So this is another volunteer on mushrooms for science. Incredible, isn't it? This gentleman could not draw, and 1 month after his sixth experience, he painted this magnificent Christ on his wall. But that's not all. Let's meet our volunteer 4 years later for a follow-up study. In the next sequence, you will see a young woman who is another volunteer. But let's stay focused on Mr. Esno for the moment and see what has changed for him since he did this last experiment. So, I find his last sentence quite moving, isn't it? It, of course, echoes experimentation with psilocybine to fight death anxiety associated with cancer diagnosis and for palliative care. Also, I think we could make a link with the necessity of integration. He integrated himself his experience. And also, I find it amazing that it only took him 5 minutes to paint his beautiful Christ on the cross. So Mr. Esno, in my opinion, illustrates well the possible personality changes induced by spiritual experiences. Let us note the theme of death and that of detachment from material things. Let us also insist on his talent for drawing, which was certainly fleeting, but it is nevertheless an extremely interesting fact, isn't it? Here we touch on the theme of optimizing human performance. But to return to the question posed, what can we learn from history for the future? I would like to know what you think. For my part, it seems to me that experiments on healthy volunteers to perfect our understanding of the effects of psilocybin would not be superfluous, as well as an ethical reflection on the personality changes that psychedelics can induce, and a broader reflection on the societal and philosophical aspects raised by the use of psychotropic drugs, perhaps within the framework of social psychopharmacology or a moral psychopharmacology, a field of interdisciplinary investigation that remains to be explored. I find this prospect very exciting, but I will leave it at that. Thank you for your attention. Do you have questions now or after?
Some questions from the audience now. Otherwise, we get discussed.
Maybe I have a question to the audience. Actually, we have experts in the room who are doing research with those medicines, and we are pointing to an interesting idea that is. So people are making research on, for example, depressive patients. But do you know any not trials actually, but experiments with people with how do we say that, neurostandard people, neurotypical people with psilocybine, for example?
What I know better are historical trials in the 50s and in the 60s.
But recently?
There are the trials of the Johns Hopkins, but I'm not sure I'm the expert on contemporary studies, but there has been studies on healthy volunteers in the Johns Hopkins units. I think it was around 1916. I look at those colleagues here, I don't know. But, and the results were quite striking with, like almost 80% of those volunteers saying that it was one of the, most significant experience in their life. You can find, online on YouTube a documentary called A New Understanding, that's about psilocybine in palliative care. But there are some video footage of those healthy volunteers giving testimonies of their own experiences with psilocybine. I think you would be interested to hear what they have to say as healthy volunteer having spiritual experiences.
Do we need to call it spiritual?
I don't know, but there are some criteria defined by philosopher Ralph Wood and psychologist, I don't remember his name, Ralph Wood and Walter Stace, to define what is spiritual experiences. If you cannot express it with words, if you have a certain transcendence of time and space, if you have feelings of peace and joy, and maybe one or two other criteria, this is a spiritual experience as defined by Ralph Wood and Walter Stace. So yes, if you define what it is, I think you can say it. But yes, in France, a very secular country, those concepts are maybe harder to manipulate in a clinical or medical framework, of course. But apparently in the US, it's not so difficult to link the effects of or the intensity of the mystical or spiritual experience to the therapeutic outcomes. In England, the team of Robin Carhart-Harris preferred to use acute psychedelic effects instead of spiritual, but they also assess the spiritual dimension with questionnaires.
Okay, maybe we can go deeper into this because I think it touches also factors of society. And, maybe interesting to talk about obstacles, why this research is so difficult to re-implement in France. So to stay in the schedule of time, I will start my presentation now. So I'm afraid I think I brought too many slides, so like always. So yeah, don't be irritated when I skip over some of them when I see that I'm running out of time. Yeah, I want to talk more in general about the current situation, and especially from the point of view from in psychiatry, like the renaissance of psychedelics in psychiatry. And I will tell the story starting from depression. We could also tell it from the starting point of addiction or of other conditions, but depression is one of the mental disorder that is being researched with psychedelics or treated in studies to a high amount. So there's starting to be good data to draw some inferences about it. So this is nothing new for you. I think everyone is more or less connected to the mental health field, and even if not, you know that during the over 2 years of the COVID pandemic, depression and anxiety have risen, and so the figures in France are like from 11 to 20%. That's a lot. It's doubling the. It's almost incredible. There's a lot of suicides, suicide ideation, also among young people. Here you see how much it touched different age groups. And so we have, on top to the known problem of depression, which you can see here, another peak of depression and anxiety linked to the COVID pandemic and I think the war situation is. Turn off the lights? Yeah, maybe it's better. You're right. Thanks. Yeah, and I think war situation in Europe and elsewhere doesn't make it better. So you see, even without the pandemic, this is data until 2017, the incidence or the prevalence of depression has risen and has grown. And so we have today more than 300 million depressed people on the world. And the question is, do they all have proper treatment? Here you see that in France, incidence goes up in the last years from 2014 to 20. And here you see one of the solutions that have been found to treat depression, which is the intake of antidepressants. So you see that there is a lot of prescription and consumption of antidepressants. France is actually, I always heard that France is the highest in consumption in Europe. That's not true. Germany is slightly over. And there's Czech Republic, Finland, and all the Scandinavian countries that are even higher, interestingly. So, but I see this is old data, but it was not easy to find data from France in the OECD statistics. I don't know why. So what about the efficacy of antidepressants? So there have been tons of clinical trials. And so all those trials have been analyzed in meta-analysis. And this is one of the biggest ones. And that said in 2018, yes, they are effective. So coming a reanalysis of the same data with some critical reevaluation of some points. This is very specific. I won't go further into it. But after they corrected for some methodological shortcomings, they found that antidepressants are not so effective. Maybe they are, in general, improving depression to only a little bit, that is on a regular scale of depression, not even measurable. Of course, there's all depressed disorders together, or light, medium, and severe depression. And we know that antidepressants work better for the severe ill. But on the whole, this is not very satisfactory, I would say. So this is just to give you an idea why one of the reasons why there's a new interest in the research on the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. So probably you're here because you also have heard about this renaissance. There have been extensive media coverage, also Netflix series, also recently, if you want to look at this. It's Arte documentary where our depression trial from Gerd Gründer in Mannheim and also from Charité Berlin, the two centers I will talk about a little more. The film team has followed us for 2 years and has done some patient interviews, and it's quite interesting. And I think they did a balanced. They did a good work to show how we work and how astonishing for some patients the change is induced by those substances. Of course, in combination with psychotherapy. So we're talking about those molecules. You probably all know that. Psilocybin is from the mushrooms and has a long tradition in Mexico and other countries. Ritual use, and this is the compound, the synthesized form that is used most often in current clinical trials. But there's also ayahuasca, which contains DMT, mescaline. There's not so many studies about this, but also, let's say, the Swiss research teams working a lot with LSD. So I think we can skip this because you saw some extracts from the archives. So this is just one scale how to measure the subjective experience of a psychedelic. This, for example, is psilocybin. You see like hallucinations, or it's not really hallucinations, but illusions mostly on the visual scale, but also synesthesia, changed meaning of perception, and also blissful feelings of unity, sometimes fearful experiences, and that all together qualify this experience as mystical or spiritual in high doses. So you already talked a little bit about, and that was the question from the audience, the effects on healthy subjects or on, neurotypical persons. There's been some studies on this. This shows if you have complete mystical experience according to the criteria of Stace, that means feeling of unity, bliss, and also ineffability, not able to talk about the experience, dissolving, like ego dissolution and so on. Then, even after months, you have, for example, they measured the trait of openness, which is part of our personality, as much higher than before. That is a little bit against the dogma that personality stays stable all over lifetime. And here you find this finding that most people in the study rated the psychedelic experience as among the 5 most meaningful events in their whole life, comparable to birth of a child or marriage or death of a close one. Here you see some recent data about the change of beliefs, of metaphysical beliefs. I think it's hard to see, but here you find some summary about this. So when you're a physicalist or a materialist, then after a strong psychedelic experience, you tend to be more a non-reductionist or even a panpsychist. That means that you have the conviction that even objects have maybe some living part in them or participate in consciousness. But now coming to therapy, because what we're doing in our research is basically about helping psychiatric patients. So this is our so-called dosing room in Berlin, in Charité. It's about set and setting. That's what already Timothy Leary said. It's still true that you need to create a nice environment in order to give a good experience to the patient. So no white room, because this can provoke some fear or panic reactions. But you make it cozy. We give a high dose, 1 or 2 occasions, some weeks apart. The patients wear a sleep mask and some headphones where they listen to specially selected music that evokes different kinds of emotions. There's 2 therapists, male and female, and our protocol is a lot about safety and support. So the psychotherapy part is kind of minimalized. Here you see some study results from the first trials. I think at least half of this room knows those slides. I've seen it many times. So this was just to make it short. The study from the UK, from London, Imperial College in 2016. It was kind of the starting point of the renaissance of clinical trials. After some trials on cancer patients, this was the first one on depression. And they found a strong effect, very fast, antidepressant effect, which lasted in, let's say, half of the patients over many months. And here you see the very strong effect sizes. If you're familiar with statistics and psychotherapy, or just a treatment, this is pretty high effect sizes, which are still detectable after 6 months, after only one intake of the psychedelic and some supportive psychotherapy sessions before and after. And one needs to say that it's pretty well tolerated. There's not many side effects. It's just confusion, nausea, transient headache, and actually they forgot to put a decent rise of blood pressure during some hours. So this is a recent trial that has been published in November, with the biggest so far, with over 230 patients, multi-site, global. It's from a company that has developed their own version of psilocybin, and pretty much successful. So they're going into phase 3, but there, as we discussed today earlier, you see already the effect that in a bigger study, the effects are not as strong. And so the antidepressive effect could be measured here after 3 weeks, 6 weeks, but not, wasn't significant on later time points. So, and there was a little concern about this trial because there was increased suicidal thoughts in all 3 groups, but we can discuss this later if you want. So this is the first and only so far comparison of psychedelic treatment with an antidepressant, escitalopram. What's it called here? It's Cipralex? Seroplex, yeah. You might know it. And even compared to this, in a double-blind fashion, psilocybin showed to be at least not inferior, and in other later analysis it showed to be, as you see here, superior. So, but of course we need more studies. Here I brought you just a meta-analysis of 8 randomized controlled trials. Now there's another one out, which I haven't read yet, with more studies included. But this shows also that all the studies have more or less strong effects, the standard mean deviation. So this is put all together and, pretty high effect, coming close to what's called seismotherapy, electroconvulsion therapy, which is a pretty intense treatment in psychiatry. So I already talked about the side effects. So this is just to make you a little anxious, but you don't have to be, because it's well tolerated if you do a good patient selection and you have a controlled supportive setting. This is very important. For example, in our study, we don't include patients with an unstable cardiac situation, or with an ongoing intense or not well treated high blood pressure, or problems with thyroid and so on. So just to say that psilocybin received a breakthrough designation from the FDA. That means that the research groups don't have to bring so many trials, or the data is assessed in a more rapid way to make it possible to have psilocybin as a medication when it turns out to be effective and safe, faster than usual. So it's a kind of fast track program. And now here you see that it's, the number of publications goes up and up. So I think this was done in 2021. So I suppose it's going even higher than this. Okay. So mechanisms of action. I will maybe do this very fast, just to say that psilocybin and any psychedelic is working on the neuronal level, then on the network level, on the individual, on let's say psychological level, and socially. So social interactions. This makes it very complex to study it. And so there's many approaches on many parts of this puzzle to find out how this works. There's receptor studies, because we know now that it's one specific receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor, that is responsible for the effect. But now we have new data that it's maybe inside of the cell. So very fascinating field and many open questions. There's an effect on neuroplasticity. That means after psychedelics, the weeks after, there's an effect on the dendrites, the density of the sprouts, so to say, of the neurons, and of the interconnections are increased. So that could correspond to something that clinically we know as a therapeutic window, or the afterglow effect, where it is easier for the patient to change perspective and to let go old views and to take on maybe new paths. So this is a model that is called predictive processing, pretty influential in cognitive science nowadays. And this is just a funny a trick, like it's called the hollow mask illusion, and it tricks you all the time because we're deeply rooted in us. There's a conviction that when we see a face, it's always looking at us. It's convex, but here you see that sometimes it's concave. It's a mask, but your brain makes you think that it's convex. One of those funny visual illusions. But you could say that they like researchers found out that psychedelics can disrupt those higher order beliefs, and so this is true not only for visual perception but also for ideas about yourself, about the world, about relationships, and so many neuroscientists think that this is one of the main major models to explain the effect. So this is on the network level, if you want. You talked about the mystical or spiritual experience. There's many hints that it can be beneficial to have one. Here it's from a clinical trial. If you have a full-blown mystical experience, then this predicts the antidepressive response some weeks later. And there's also like collected data in form of review that also indicate that in most studies this was found. So that means the quality of the psychedelic experience is really important for the outcome. That's one hypothesis, but one was not able so far to test this hypothesis properly because you cannot really put someone to sleep and give him psychedelics, so he doesn't have any kind of subjective experience. Or maybe you can, but nobody has done it so far. So I already said that psychotherapy has a big part. That's what we think. That's why we do it. That's why we think that it's important to have sufficient number of sessions to prepare the patient to integrate what he or she has experienced. So here you see that can sometimes be challenging and brings up forgotten memories from childhood. Are they true? Are they fictional? We don't know. But this is something we can work with in psychotherapy. So there's different models. This is a historical model from psychoanalysis. The flashes they indicate from publications where psychodynamic therapists have found that psychedelics increase this key mechanism. For example, the therapeutic relationship is stronger or can be stronger. There's more regression, which plays a part in psychoanalysis. Free associations are more frequent, and so on. So there's a whole model of explanation from the psychoanalysis why those substances work, but also from the CBT, like cognitive behavioral perspective. There's models that help us to understand why this could work. Basically, this model is about a shift by psychedelics, induced by psychedelics, from the state of avoidance. This can also mean avoid feelings, to acceptance. And, so this could lead then to a revision of deeply rooted dysfunctional beliefs. So it's not so far from the neuro, scientific explanation. And last but not least, there are common factors in psychotherapy. That means independently from the method that they apply, there's things like the patient-therapist relationship, working alliance, expectancy effects that play a role in the placebo effect, and others, motivation for change. Those are totally independent of my psychotherapy method, but it seems like psychedelics are boosting all those factors. So this could also be a good explanation why it works together. Okay, so last point. This is the study we do in Mannheim and Berlin, the episode study. It is about treatment-resistant depression, where we don't have good treatment. So we started with this patient group. It's governmentally funded. We have a 3-arm parallel design. We talked about this earlier. So just for the people that haven't been on the workshop, we test a high dose of psilocybin against a small dose, and the third arm is a placebo substance. And for ethical reasons, all the patients that did not receive the high dose in the first place, they get the high dose six weeks later. And also we have one part of the patients that receive 2 full doses. So we can also test this hypothesis if this brings a better or more sustained effect. So we created a manual for that, inspired by other manuals that already exist. We will publish this at some point to make it accessible for other groups. And basically, this is doing what all the other groups do, maybe with some detail, some differences in the details. But like all the groups, we do like a preparation phase, a dosing phase, and an integration phase. So maybe what could be a difference is that we have on total 30 hours of contact with 2 psychotherapists. So that is a lot, but we see that it's not even enough, because often there's a process that is started in the patient that is not ended after the end of the study. So to conclude, we have seen so far in studies and also in our trial a rapid antidepressant effect. Not for everyone, but for a good proportion of the patients. It is safe under medical supervision. It seems to have effect on different mental disorders, not only depression. And there's some very interesting aspects that I listed here that make it interesting to further research on. But of course, there's always the hype effect with new treatments, like it was the case in the antidepressants also. That means the small studies at the beginning, they show strong effects, and later we have to see which amount of effect stays in bigger populations. So there's a lot of challenges. I think I will skip this, but we can talk about this later. And the last slide, maybe to give over the microphone to you, Lucie. Where are we standing in France right now concerning this therapy, this research? So I listed some of the colleagues who came here to this workshop from Paris, Bordeaux, Montpellier, Nîmes, Marseille. Marseille, I noted there's a strong interest, but we have nobody has written a protocol or funding or anything. So I think Marseille has to organize himself or at least collaborate. So, and those are milestones that are listed here. Luc Mallet, who's here in the audience, and others founded a section in the Biological Psychiatric Association, AFBVN, for médecine psychédélique. So this is something that wasn't possible 5 years ago, I think. And of course, the activities from the SPF, and which is very valuable, I think. And the first trial with psychedelics starting in Paris in September with 2 groups, and we have some representatives here, and I'd be very happy to hear more about this. Thank you. Shall we continue? I suggest we just continue with the next talk, so we have more time for discussion at the end. So I have the pleasure to announce Lucie Berkovich, psychiatrist in Sainte-Anne, University of Psychiatry in Paris. And at the same time, you're a resident in Yale University in the US?
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
So I give you...
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry for this delay. So yeah, I'm working, in fact, basically with a team in Sainte-Anne Hospital in Paris, a psychiatric team. And I will mostly present like the work that we are doing, so that all the French team are doing and that we talked about a lot this afternoon, and also just to provide all my affiliation. I'm a postdoctorate currently in Yale University, and I'm just doing go and back to France and to the US, which is not very ecological. But anyway, so I'm going to talk about really like the upcoming clinical trials with psychedelics in France. So in fact, it's not my work. It's really, it will be the reflect of a collective work that we talked about a lot this afternoon and involving many people here. So I will probably not be able to answer your question, and you will probably have to address your question directly to the responsible of these studies. So just a very short, introduction, but we've talked about, and we also have almost the same picture. So we're talking about the psychedelics that are like a group of molecules, including psilocybine, which is the active compound of magic mushrooms, the LSD, the DMT that is contained in ayahuasca, mescaline. And there are also new derivatives such as 2CB or many synthetic molecules that share some chemical properties and also are able to induce this psychedelic experience. Anyway, all these molecules, they have a common pharmacological mechanism of action, so they are going to activate those specific receptors that are called the 5-HT2A receptors, and that are in fact receptors for the serotonin. And this has been shown to trigger some subjective effects. So here is really a very brief overview of what you can see sometimes under psychedelics. So this kind of motion effects But of course, there is many other effects that you can have, and that Michael described a bit, including mystical experience. And depending on the dose, you can even experience what is called ego dissolution. And very interestingly, these molecules are not only able to trigger subjective effects, which is the reason why they are very well known. They are also able to be to provide therapeutic effects in different psychiatric disorders. So we had a lot of info about that for depression, but it's not only on depression that these psychedelics are efficient. And I would like to mention again that it's not psychedelic only that will have this efficacy in psychiatric disorders, but it's really the combination between psychedelic administration and a full psychotherapeutic work that is done before, during, and after administration. And I will not spend long time on this. So this is just the main graph of this huge study on depression, showing that there is an immediate and a long-lasting effect of psilocybin at 25 milligrams to treat depression. So this is the COMPASS studies that involve more than 200 patients. And just to show you the broad application, there is also like same kind of graphs that you can find in older trials that use psilocybin or LSD in anxiety associated with life-threatening diseases, so in palliative care, and also in addiction. So here is a recent study showing that psilocybin was able to decrease the number of drinks per day in patients who have like alcohol use disorder. But there are like other few studies on that topic, especially also on tobacco. And there is a lot of ongoing trials, like at the worldwide, in fact, and notably like phase 2 and phase 3 trials in depression and anxiety, and also under other indications that are currently explored. And there is, in fact, trials, for example, on OCD, notably in Yale University, on eating disorders, on pain, on PTSD, on autistic spectrum disorders. So it's really like we have these molecules that seem to work on many psychiatric conditions that are very difficult to treat so far. Well, and now I'm going to talk about my main topic. What about research in France? So I will just split this talk into two parts. The first part is about really clinical trials, and then I will present like few trials about more the mechanisms of actions of these molecules. So clinical trials first. So I will show like all the studies that are currently like in progress. So you have the name. Oh no. You cannot see the name of the people that I put like on the bottom, so I will just say it orally. So this is probably one of the most advanced study, which is exploring the effect of LSD in alcohol dependence, and this is a trial that is conducted mostly by Luc Mallet, who is there, but also other people, and notably Charles Dorek, who is there too. The main idea is to see whether LSD will help patients to maintain abstinence after a phase of detoxification of alcohol, we can say, or cessation of alcohol. So patients that will be included will have to meet the criteria for diagnosis of severe alcohol use disorder. So we know in clinical practice that this patient it's very difficult for them to manage to stop their consumption, and there will be about 150 patients in this study. And also this patient will have a previous relapse after treatments. So it's not only severe, but it's also that after a good trial, they unfortunately relapse in their alcohol use. So this is the randomization design. So there will be 3 different doses of LSD, 10 milligrams with trisantidol as a microdose, so placebo, 100 microgram and 300 micrograms. And this is like the timeline. So basically the patient will arrive in a unit to do the alcohol withdrawal for 14 days. And then there will be a dosing session associated with psychotherapy with these 3 possible doses. And then like a follow-up with many assessments to try to see if under higher dose of LSD there is less relapse than under low dose of LSD, which is the control condition. So this is the primary endpoint. Second study, so the PAD psilocybin study, which is a pilot study, again, in alcohol use disorder, but not with the same molecule. And the main idea here is also to see like the double effect of psilocybin, both on alcohol use disorder and depression. So the patient will have like these 2 diseases at the same time. And the main idea is to compare, again, 2 doses of psychedelic, which is something that we usually do. So we use psychedelic low dose as a comparator to psychedelic high dose, so we can keep the full set and setting around that and compare really the dose dependent effects. And they will have 2 sessions 3 weeks apart, in case they have still depressive symptoms after stopping alcohol consumption, because we know that there is an interaction between the 2, and people that consume alcohol, they will have depressive symptoms that may be induced by also this chronic alcohol consumption. So this is the timeline again. So first they are hospitalized to stop alcohol, and then they will have like 2 sessions. The first one will take place in like rehabilitation units, and the second one also, but they will be assessed after they are out of the hospital. And the primary endpoint would be acceptability and feasibility. And like, of course, the main point also of interest are alcohol use after discharge at different time points and the depressive scales. Oops, sorry. I have a problem with the animation. So this is another study. Sorry, I didn't say so. Previous, it was Amandine Lukian's in NIMS. Sorry. So now it's a study by Robertas Strumilas in NIMS and Montpellier, a collaboration. So basically the idea is that we will assess the effect of psilocybin at two possible way of administration in anorexia nervosa. So 40 patients with anorexia nervosa, and they will have either microdosing, so small dosing that are repeated in time during 2 months, or placebo. And then in the second part of the study, they will either continue microdosing if they were in the microdosing arm, or have a classical psilocybin assisted psychotherapy with a full dose of psilocybin. And the main endpoint will be like the scales for eating disorder and the tolerance, because it's a more fragile population. And I will now talk about so this is the study. You can ask a question to me because it's the study that will be conducted in Saint-Anne. And here is a bit different. So we want to go a bit deeper in the effect of psilocybin in depression, and also to include patients that are usually excluded from a clinical trial, namely the patient who have also a bipolar disorder. So it's we call that bipolar depression. And we will include patients that will not respond to usual treatment, and propose to give them either psilocybin or ketamine, which is not a psychedelic, but which is a molecule that has been validated as a treatment for treatment-resistant depression, unipolar or bipolar. And the main interest of this comparison is that ketamine also triggers subjective effects. So we'll be able to compare and to keep blindness. So basically, patients will not know, hopefully, either they have ketamine or psilocybin. And also, we don't know so much for ketamine whether the adjunction of psychotherapy is a good thing. I mean, it's necessarily a good thing, but does it provide really a substantial improvement compared to just normal administration without psychotherapy, which is the way it's given now for 20 years for the treatment of depression. So now it's without psychotherapy. I want to see if there is any true value of that. So this is the design: 3 arms. psilocybine plus psychotherapy, or ketamine plus psychotherapy, or ketamine without psychotherapy. And we would like to compare these different conditions with this timeline, so different scales. But the most important thing is that we will check like the difference between depression scale before and after administration. Another point that is really important for these patients is the tolerability, because it was so we know that for this patient, antidepressant can trigger affective switch. So they can have like manic episodes that are triggered by administration of antidepressants. So it's of course a main concern, because it's a side effect. It's destabilized the mood episode, the mood disorder, and we want to prevent that. And there were like few case reports of affective switch under psychedelic that were reported just by people taking that on their side. And the other problem is the interaction with the treatment. So we want to check also whether there is risks of taking mood stabilizer and psilocybine, which may be the case because there is one study showing that LSD associated with lithium, so people under lithium that experiment LSD have a higher risk to have seizures. So it's also an important concern. So this is another study that we will do in Saint-Anne, and in this case we want to check the role of subjective effects. So Michael also talk about that a bit. And for now on, it's like still debated whether this subjective effect, this psychedelic experience, is necessary to obtain like a clinical response. So we will again include patients, but this time with unipolar treatment-resistant depression. And the design will include pre-treatment by ketanserine, which is an antidote, like an antagonist of the serotonergic receptors at 2 different doses. And we want to compare whether psilocybine associated with this antidote that really suppress all the subjective and cerebral effect, like most of them, is still efficient on depression, or if it just like ruins the efficacy. So we will have again 3 arms: so psilocybine like normal with psychotherapy, psilocybine plus pre-administration of ketanserine with 2 different doses, and just a placebo group to check also if ketanserine, if under psilocybine plus ketanserine, we still have a little bit of efficacy compared to a placebo condition. So the timeline is the same, and we will check the difference again after and before treatment for depression scales, and we will also try to correlate the intensity of subjective effect and the evolution of depressive scale. And this is like the last clinical trial that I will talk about. So this is so Compass is this big lab. They are trying to set up they're like a follow-up of the study that I showed you before and that Michael showed you too. So that demonstrate that psilocybine is efficient in a large cohort of patients with treatment-resistant depression. And they would like to continue this study in France. So we are one of the center, but it's a multi-centric study. And there will be about 500 patients. Unfortunately, I will not be able to tell you a lot about this study. So they will test the efficacy and the tolerability of their compound, which is called COMP 360, in association with psychotherapy. But the protocol is still under discussion. So we don't know yet exactly when it will start. So it's probably not for September 2023 of this year, but maybe, I don't know. We are still trying to set that up. And because it's a multicentric study, it's not so easy. But again, like the previous study was really quite impressive in terms of results. And this is just the summary of the previous study. Okay. Second part is about the neural mechanism of therapeutic effects. So, there is I will talk about also several studies, that took place here, so that in France. So the first one is trying to evaluate how psilocybine changed the positive valence system in patients. So what we call positive valence system is a bit cryptic, but it's a cognitive measure in particular of effort. So Patients will be included if they have moderate to severe treatment-resistant depressive disorder. And there will be, in this case, fMRI before and after intake. With two conditions, resting state is just people doing nothing, and for expenditure for reward task is saying it's a task that will try to see whether people are prone to do some effort to obtain rewards. So this is the overview of the protocol, and this is a study that takes place in Nîmes by Georges Lopez-Kesselman, who is there, so you can ask questions to him. And the main idea is to assess the activity of some neural circuit that will be included in this trade-off between effort and reward. So how much you are okay to do an effort to obtain some reward, and we know that is something that is impaired in depression. A second study tried to explore the neural correlate of cognitive control in patients who has psychogenic non-epileptic seizures. So it's in fact a population that has never been really explored for the treatment with psilocybin. So there are two interests. There is the therapeutic interest, but this study is more focused on the neural correlate of cognitive control, so the ability to to control your actions, and so it's a proof of concept study with these patients that will be included, and they will also have fMRI before and after intake with a task that is called emotional go-no-go. So basically, you show faces that can have different facial expression, emotional expression, and you ask patients to press a button either for male or female. So this is a task that is normally unrelated to facial expression, but you will see how much the facial expression can interfere with this ability to not press if it's not the instruction that they have to follow. And this will be so the primary endpoint will be again brain activation during this task before and after treatment, but also the secondary endpoints about the efficacy, in fact, in this population. And just very quickly saying that in our study, we also plan to do some neuroimaging explorations. So we want to check whether there is changes in resting state and cognitive tasks, in particular perceptual tasks, in this study comparing psilocybin and ketamine in patients with bipolar disorder. So we'll try to do some fMRI at different time points, before, during, and after session, even if during it may be difficult, and try to see whether there are differences of similarities between psilocybin and ketamine in their neurocognitive effects. And in this second study also, we will do the same, but here the goal will be to assess the neural correlates of subjective effects and the relationship that may exist between these neural correlates and the therapeutic outcomes. Okay, I'm almost done. Maybe just to explain why are we so late? So basically, it's really complicated to set up these studies, and all the people who are working on that field know that it takes a lot of time. There is a lot of administrative stuff, a lot of steps, and it can be quite discouraging. So it's not so simple, and people are always asking why it didn't start yet, but it's not so easy. So what are the steps? So first, you need to have money. And this is really, really difficult to have people that are okay to give you money to do some psychedelic research, because it's still a risky field. So until recently, it was pretty much impossible in France to have some money to do psychedelic research. And we had to wait that there are more and more evidence for the efficacy and the safety, of course, of these molecules to gain money. Second, you have to import substances that are illegal. So it's not easy at all to obtain the right to take some substances that are, made in the US and to bring that in Europe. So it's complicated to have the right to do that, to stock, to have this in your hospital, etc., etc. And finally, even if it's probably less complicated, but you have to train therapists, and we talk also about that this afternoon, because most of the countries that already have this psychedelic assisted therapy, they are English speaking, and like, as you may know, French people are not always English speaking. It's not only psychologists or psychotherapists, it's everybody. So it's still, it can be a problem to train therapists. And on top of that, there is also like the hospital crisis, the problem of availability of caregivers, the problem of having a dedicated place, and so many things. But I'm quite confident that French society is ready, in fact, and waiting for that, especially the patients, of course, because they see like that abroad it's possible to be treated by these molecules that are still evaluated. But there is more and more articles, radio programs about psychedelic in France. I just want to talk a bit more about this section de médecine psychédélique de l'Association française de psychiatrie biologique, with no American accent. And just to say that we created that last year, and the main purpose was to help each other to get rid of all these obstacles that I just mentioned. So the founders, so it's an original idea of Luc Mallet, and Bruno Romeo is there also. Hugo Botman and myself are part of the board. I don't know how to say that. And our different goals are to bring together all professionals that may be interested in psychedelic medicine, to try to build like constructive scientific exchange, promote knowledge, and try to collaborate and to encourage the collaboration between teams, and to help the development of projects, and also to communicate about psychedelic research to the general public. So, for example, the event that we are in today is totally part of what we may want to do as a section de médecine psychédélique, because it's scientific exchange, collaboration between clinicians, and also like communication to the public. And so it started. So we did already a webinar that you can find online about the mechanisms of psychedelic and ketamine in different psychiatric disorders. But there will be more and more communication. Conclusion, and sorry I was too long too. So these molecules have a very high potential. There are many studies that are in preparation, exploring many things with different molecules, but also, as you have seen, like in many also different indications. So it hasn't started yet, but it should start soon. I don't want to provide like dates because there may be delays, like when you are building a house, but still. And I think it's really important to emphasize the need to help each other and to collaborate. And I want to thank Michael for organizing, and all people that contribute to organize this workshop, because I think it's really the way to solve all our difficulties. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Very great presentation. Okay, so we are a little behind our schedule, but that's not so bad. Could I invite the panel participants to sit here? I think we are still lacking 2 or 3 chairs. Professor Gerd Gründer, Lea Mertens, Vincent Tours. Thank you already so much for your attention. I know it's not easy. It's dark outside. It's dark inside. No, not now, but during the talks. There was a lot of research details, for me, very interesting things. But I know that you're coming from different backgrounds. So yeah, this discussion is now open for your questions. Maybe we take some questions from the audience before we go to questions from the chat. Everyone tired?
So if there's, I will take the first question. And my first question would be to Carhart, because I would like to know his opinion about the development of trials in France with respect to what you heard today. Are you optimistic or skeptical?
Of course, I'm optimistic. 3 years ago, everybody would have said that Germany is far behind. So you just have to start one trial, and then the door is open, and then it's then I think everything changes. So you just have to do the first step, open the door, and then the things will go on very smoothly.
But is it the case in Germany, for example? Are there other places where
many places are interested, but it's still complicated in terms of, as you heard, drug supply. That's the major hurdle is money. We still need funding. And the second hurdle is drug supply. Where do you get GMP substances? So good manufacturing practice. Drugs in a quality that you can apply them to humans in clinical trials. And I think the regulators or ethics committees do not represent a hurdle anymore. The doors are open now.
Just 2 questions. The first is, what can we do for help, for example, European or national agency that could finance this trial? What can we do? I mean, is it possible to have to push for an European funding for this kind of trials? Would be the best
on the
solution.
European level. There a lot of things are going on. On EU level, the regulators are, there's really a lot going on, and I'm sure there will be money from the European Union for psychedelic research.
Because for the moment, it's just the National Agency of Research. There is no other.
Yeah, but you could, of course, apply for an EU program.
Yeah.
We could work together. French and German institutions could work together on a joint venture and get funding from the EU. That would be possible.
Would be the best solution. And the question on content. In all your presentation, the part with the therapy was very neutral. I mean, okay, you have the administration of the substance and then the therapy, psychotherapy, but we don't know what is this therapy and how long it lasts, because it seems that 6 weeks is not very long, because after 6 weeks of, I don't know, psychoanalysis or something else, you could be better and then you go down. So what we know about that, and what is this therapy that is conceived as an important part of the trial?
I think I would just start, and then maybe Michael wants to add something. I 100% agree. I think the issue is that in the trial so far, we pretty much have like a pharmaceutical perspective on that kind of therapy. So it's considered a pharmaceutical treatment, a drug trial, and a lot of the studies that have been published, they have quite limited psychotherapy. Some don't even call it psychotherapy. They call it psychological support, because they don't want to, because it's kind of, there is an awareness that it would be unsafe to apply these substances without any support in it. But it's also like a regulatory questions. What are you going to approve in the end? Are you going to approve the drug, or are you going to approve the drug together with psychotherapy? And then the question is, of course, what kind of psychotherapy has to be implemented. And I think it's a very, very important question, and there will definitely need to be more research going into this. But we had that discussion in the afternoon as well, that maybe it's not the time yet to compare different types of psychotherapy schools before the drugs have been approved, because that adds another level of complexity to those kind of trials, which are already very complex and difficult to do. So I think kind of comparing different different styles of psychotherapy will be a question for after approval.
Yeah, just to add one thought about it. We are all talking about psychotherapy within clinical trials. But if you look outside of clinical trials, then you might look at Switzerland. The Swiss people are very special. They have, you should, in respect of psychedelic therapy, they have had different phases of many years with exceptional authorization from the government to work with psychedelics, but in a very free way. And still, it's possible, and a growing number of therapists do like exceptional, on a case-to-case basis therapy, where they apply the government and they say, okay, this patient needs treatment. I can give it to him with LSD or psilocybin, whatever. And when there's the permission for this patient, then the therapist can say, okay, I'm doing 2 years of psychotherapy now in a psychodynamic way or CBT. And I'm doing like every 3 months a session, and I start with maybe a low dose of MDMA to not produce too much panic or fear reaction. And then I go over to a different molecule like LSD or psilocybin, and then I increase the dose. And so they really have a creative freedom to do what seems to be necessary in combination with those molecules. And so we are so much restricted in our clinical trials, also with concerning funding and ethics. So we should keep in mind that this was the first trial in Germany, or is, and so there are others to follow. And once, maybe in some years, if everything works out well, we have approval, then we can experiment in the real setting and take advantage of longer psychotherapies.
Okay. Sorry for the English; it's not very easy for me. So I was surprised of the number of actual trial using psychedelics in France, because I was thinking that it was forbidden in France, and you presented a lot of actual trials. So yes, it's very encouraging. And I was particularly in peculiar. I was interested about the one you talked about in the psychogenic non-epileptic seizures, and I was wondering where it's happening, because I'm usually seeing a lot of these patients in Marseille, and I would be very interested in participating to this trial.
Yes. So maybe it was not very clear in my talk, I realize now. So this trial are in construction, are in progress, but they haven't started yet. So we are not currently recruiting patients, none of us, unfortunately. I just wanted to show how high was finally the diversity of these trials that are like currently arriving, let's say. So you can talk, I think, to the person who is directly in charge with this trial about psychogenic non-epileptic seizures, and I'm sure he will be glad to answer you into more details. And regarding the psilocybin, like why more psilocybin than something else? You're right. In fact, other molecules showed like evidence. So LSD and also ayahuasca, there is not so many, like almost no study with mescaline so far, except the very old one, no recent study. I guess there is just an effect of like it's easier to do a study with psilocybin because there are more previous study with psilocybin. So basically we are just continuing with the same molecule because probably it's the molecule that has been the most studied. So we have more information about its safety and its efficacy profile. But there is no reason to think that the other molecule work less. Probably they work a bit differently, but the mechanism of action is very close. And in fact, there are also like worldwide other study using DMT, so ayahuasca or LSD. So it's not like only psilocybin. I guess to start, it's easier with something that has been more experimented. Yes.
So just to understand what you present is that project, but that has not been approved yet.
So depending on the project, they are at different steps, but they didn't start yet. Yes.
Some of them have been accepted by the financial support.
Some of them are already funded. Some of them have reached some steps in terms of obtaining the molecule that is needed, etc. But none of them have started.
None of them.
Yeah. Sorry, I realized that it was absolutely not clear in my talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to de-zoom a little bit to ask you a kind of general question. We can see and hear words like spiritual, mystical in some psychiatric trial. It can seem like really rare for our contemporary vision of what is psychiatry. Because, as we know in the history of France and Europe, we separated spirituality and the actual fact of treating psychological suffering with a scientific view and a spiritual view. And do you think that we generally come to a point where maybe we're gonna melt again these two notions, and where the spiritual side of the psychological suffering is meeting again the scientific view?
Yeah, I can just say something before passing the mic to somebody else, but actually I think the topic of spirituality is already addressed within the field of palliative care at the hospital. I cannot say much more about it, but the field is not absolutely absent from the medical service in palliative care.
I just wanted to add another question and not answer this one, because I think it's a difficult one. One we have to maybe think about. Maybe we can get further into this discussion. Because just before you said that, I was having in mind to ask the audience and everyone, why do you think you're so late in France? Are there society factors? Are there like factors like historical ones? Because I learned from you that there was a part of history in psychiatry in France that made it difficult for those molecules to be successful. And so there was kind of a dead end. But I think there's more to it concerning the society, maybe. There's an open question. Is there anything in the French culture or history that makes it difficult to adopt this kind of treatment? And maybe this could touch the question of the separation of spirituality and materialism.
So, if anybody else wants to talk, I would answer your question with a clear yes. I think one problem of psychiatry over the last 60 years, since we are treating patients with psychotropic drugs, antidepressants, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, tranquilizers, they all came into psychiatry at the same time, 60 years ago. Since then, psychiatry has really focused on biological model or biosocial model, and it has lost connection to the question you just asked. And now if you look into the best journals, the JAMA Psychiatry, one of the best psychiatric journals, they now publish studies on the role of spirituality for well-being. And there is now clear evidence that people with a sense of spirituality, a sense of religion, belonging to greater meaning, that they are doing better in terms of mental health. So, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is a means of strengthening the relationship between these various aspects that concern psychiatry, and so we are broadening the focus.
Oui, excusez-moi, je ne vais pas parler en anglais parce que je ne possède pas la langue anglaise orale. Écrite, ça va, mais orale, ça va pas. Donc moi, ça fait plus de 40 ans que je suis psychiatre et plus de 40 ans que je m'intéresse aux psychédéliques. Et donc, je suis avec attention ces débats parce que, pour moi, d'un point de vue épistémologique, il y a une fracture en psychiatrie en France entre les universités, les grands services hospitaliers. Je suis parisien d'origine. J'aurais pu aller faire mon internat à Sainte-Anne, à Villejuif, à Paul-Brousse, ou etc. Ce qui n'a pas été le cas. Moi, j'ai travaillé dans les centres pour addicts, on disait toxicomanes à l'époque. Et donc, il y a 40 ans, l'intérêt des psychédéliques chez les addicts était évident. C'était tous les jours, c'était nos patients, ceux qu'on a appelés les anges déchus de la planète Saint-Michel. Je travaillais rue de l'Abbaye, association Abbaye, qui soignait les toxicomanes, avant même l'ouverture de Marmottan. Et donc, on utilisait ces produits-là. Puis bon, comme à l'époque, c'était la fin du mouvement hippie, on les auto-expérimentait. Hein, on se gorgeait de LSD, etc. La question de l'argent n'a jamais été un problème. La question de la qualité des produits n'a jamais été un problème. Hein, dans les années 90, moi, j'ai été le seul Français dans un colloque international à Amsterdam où il y avait Albert Hofmann, il y avait Alexander Shulgin, il y avait Christian Ratch, il y avait Metzner, etc. Donc, du LSD, c'était relativement facile de voir du LSD d'extrêmement bonne qualité, dans des quantités impressionnantes, à l'époque, en fréquentant ce milieu-là. Donc, en l'utilisant simplement, oui. On était des psychiatres de banlieue, des psychiatres de la rue, des psychiatres s'occupaient de toxicos, qui avaient une grande expérience des psychédéliques, et on pouvait accompagner des psychothérapies sans donner les produits, bien sûr. Sinon, on n'aurait pas fait long feu au niveau juridique. Mais on pouvait faire ce travail-là. Et c'était un travail qui était issu de la clinique et de la psychothérapie. Donc moi, ça fait maintenant des années, je suis à la retraite là depuis quelques semaines. J'ai jamais pu rentrer dans ce système moderne des essais cliniques. Pour moi, ça n'a pas de sens dans ma pratique. C'est pas des essais cliniques, c'est l'expérience clinique. C'est l'expérience clinique qui nous a apporté effectivement aujourd'hui ce qu'on pourrait certainement participer dans ces formations pour thérapeutes sur ces expériences qui se sont faits autour de la psychothérapie, avec l'adjonction de la question des psychédéliques, mais comme un outil secondaire. Alors moi, je ne nie pas tous les effets neurobiologiques passionnants, de reconnexion, de plasticité cérébrale, tout ça je connais un petit peu. Hein. Mais le plus intéressant, c'est, je trouvais ça très intéressant, Vincent, là, ta présentation, avec les 3 petits MP4 là, de l'expérience ancienne, c'est de l'inconscient qui parle. Le terme d'inconscient, qui l'utilise aujourd'hui? On avait de l'inconscient. Voilà, ça parlait comme ça. Et donc ça, à partir du moment où on reconnaît le discours de l'inconscient, on peut faire de la psychothérapie avec Mademoiselle Barrault. C'est ça qui me paraît important, d'un point de vue épistémologique. Donc moi, je suis inquiet, j'en ai rien à faire à mon âge. Mais c'est vrai que si ça reste purement un objet des universités, un objet des essais cliniques, un objet d'un certain nombre de personnes, éminemment, et tous, moi aussi j'ai un doctorat, mais enfin, certainement j'ai des CV vachement moins importants que les vôtres. Il faudrait peut-être que retourner pour explorer le milieu underground. Tous les cliniciens qui n'ont jamais publié parce qu'ils ne pouvaient pas parler. Tous les cliniciens qui ont expérimenté parce qu'ils ne pouvaient pas le dire. Hein. C'est-à-dire qui a pu travailler, on est certainement des dizaines ou des centaines. Hein, il y a un exemple qui est un peu connu parce qu'il a écrit un bouquin, c'est Olivier Chambon, donc il est parti vers la Suisse. Mais bon, il était psychiatre, praticien hospitalier à Lyon, au Villatier. Il a eu un parcours au départ de psychiatre classique du service public. Et à un moment donné, effectivement, on rentre dans l'underground pour pratiquer ça. Donc là, je crois qu'il y a tout un travail historique important, au-delà de la médecine psychédélique, mais c'est comment les psychédéliques ont participé de l'évolution des psychothérapies.
Thank you, Christian. I take the advantage of the mic to say that we just have proposed a big project of during 4 years, so we hope we will get the fund in order to study in part the actions of underground therapy in France, and also the use of the people who take themselves psychedelics to try to cure themselves without a therapist. So yes, there is studies that are currently doing in Marseille with Perrine Roux, who will study the use of lay people who use psychedelics, and then maybe if we have the grant, we will study the work of underground therapists in France. But there is study like this in other country in Europe. Maybe Luc, you want to?
Thank you. So based on your answer, I can just figure what the colleague just said. But would you mind translating? Like, just give a rough overview about his.
I try to do a short summary. You were saying that it's important to also look at the underground therapists who have worked with those substances for many years, and you were part of this network, let's say, and because that is where the experience has been growing, and not in the universities, and that it should not be limited to university use. Is that right? Yeah. So I think I can totally see your point, and I think there was a good answer that it should be studied in field studies, in anthropological, historical approaches, qualitative studies, to really interview the people who have worked with it. But I see a big problem in underground therapies. That it's not transparent what's happening because it is forbidden. And so maybe you followed also the discussion about those cases of abuse from underground therapies. There was a whole discussion last year on the podcast. What was it called? Cover Story. This is really interesting to see that even therapists from that work in current registered trials, they had their training from underground therapists, or maybe they performed as underground therapists. We don't know. And then they do like abuse, physical, sexual, psychological abuse in those situations where the patient is very weak, very suggestible, and you can do almost anything, any kind of manipulation, and you don't have any resistance in this state from the patient. So there's a lot of power abuse, I think, that has been done. Of course, this is maybe only true for 5% or 1% of the therapists, but that's enough, you know. And so I think we have to bring it, if we look at the future, to bring it to some kind of regulation of the training, of the selection of therapists, to work on their qualities, to observe the patient relationship, power abuse, and also so on. Like it is in any therapy, doctors and so on. you can only have supervision and quality control if there's like an official, not forbidden way of working, I think.
Just to add something, we have to acknowledge the fact that underground therapists kept the knowledge around psychedelic therapy and sedent setting, so that we can, no, not we, because I'm not a psychiatrist, but psychiatrists can restart research more easily because this knowledge have not been forgotten. And so there is also a study by Erika Dick in Canada, which will studies this past therapists who kept the knowledge during the 70s and the 80s. So yeah, there is study. They will be published in the next year. Tu as compris ou tu veux que je te redire après?
I would also like to say something about underground therapies. First, yes, it is the elephant in the room because there is a huge network of underground therapists, and I personally know some victims of the terrorist attacks in Paris that have benefited from underground therapy. So I can say that is a good thing that there are those people. But on the other hand, as you might know, at the French Psychedelic Society, we run online integration circles to welcome people that had some distressing psychedelic experiences. And we see a lot of people coming from underground circles feeling the need for psychological support. Also, when I was in Sweden in a regular training, official with psychotherapists, even though I'm not a clinician, I'm sorry, I sneaked myself in the room. There were like 30 or 40 psychotherapists from all over Europe interested in psychedelics, and all of them has a welcome in their practice victims of maybe high doses or people that needed to consult, ask for psychological help after having been in underground circles. So I think you said the word appropriation. I think, no, it's a good idea that the official science finally starts to study those fascinating fields, because it cannot stay in the underground. It's not safe. And yeah, maybe those underground practitioners feel disempowered or maybe stolen or something, but I think it's better if it's official and regulated.
Effectivement, quand je parle d'appropriation, je parle pas d'appropriation frauduleuse, parce que l'appropriation par la biologie, qui fait une sélection psychédélique, mais à partir du moment où ça fait la clinique, avec son éthique, je parle effectivement de thérapeute, belge, c'est clair, de standard, un peu sur le modèle de personne en Suisse, cette expérience-là, qui était un peu, ils avaient le droit, on n'a pas. Mais quand je parle d'appropriation, c'est l'appropriation par la science d'aujourd'hui, c'est-à-dire la biologie et le comportementalisme. Donc ça va avoir des effets sur le développement des thérapies, l'acceptation par la population. C'est un point essentiel, c'est travailler sur les effets indésirables. Quelqu'un qui va bien dans sa tête, qui a une bonne vie et qui fait de la découverte, qui fait un expérience mystique, c'est génial. On connaît bien ça. Mais passion. On a eu qui sont psychiatres, qui ont besoin de dépression grave, avec des traumatismes anciens, des addictions, quelle est l'origine de la psychopathologie de l'addiction. Toutes ces questions-là, au moins, doivent être à la source de la proposition thérapeutique. Là, c'est la biologie. C'est intéressant, je suis participé, je suis très content de votre solution. Mais j'ai cette inquiétude. Monsieur, tu es le du chef.
I totally see your point. Because he was saying that he's afraid that there's a process of appropriation from biological psychiatry point of view going on, and taking maybe or distorting like essential things of this therapy form. the comportamentalism and biological psychiatry kind of taking over to interpret this very complex way. And I think you are more like coming from a psychoanalytical path. I totally agree on this point that we have to be very cautious to not reduce this phenomenon to something very technical and secular and comportamental or behavioral. Any other opinions about that?
I would also say, or I would also appreciate many of the things that have been done by underground therapists and those who have been underground therapists and now are maybe doing other things and teaching others. But there's one very practical and concrete problem, which is that I can only talk about Germany, where we had in 2009 and then in 2014, there have been cases of accidents in underground therapy, like in 2009 in Berlin, there were 2 deaths, and in underground, from an underground therapist, a very experienced underground therapist who had done this for many years, and then in 2014 by other therapists who did this, and these very difficult steps forward, very small steps that science and clinical research is doing to establish psychedelic therapy are like really in danger by those accidents that are happening, because in the public view on these substances, those accidents which come out of, I don't know which kind of practices, but really are a danger for getting on. And I think it's important that psychedelic therapies come out of the cupboard, and that we are not doing, or people are not doing, illegal therapy in 20 years, but that it becomes a legal and established therapy as other therapies. So I think this is a very practical reason why research is important, and underground therapy can be really a problem.
So maybe Arnaud, if you want to make a closing remark, because we have our evening is not finished yet, and we would like to close the discussion now.
So let's close it now. There has been a few questions from people who were following you by Zoom, and the main question, there were 2, but it was the same question from people who are suffering from depression, and they were asking, how can I participate to the future trials? So do you have any practical response to that?
So yes, so I think we will broadly communicate that we start the trials when it will start. So there will be no problem to, I think, be aware if you follow like a bit the news on the psychedelic clinical trials. So I think it's the main answer. The problem is that I don't want to say to people to write to the hospital right now, because we will not be able to manage all the requests. Maybe the other thing is that we will ask people to have already a follow-up and to be addressed by a psychiatrist, and not to spontaneously ask, because we know that we will have a lot of requests. This is something that we know from abroad. So maybe if they don't have a follow-up, to start to get in touch with someone that may be able to address them. And I'm sorry, I'm a bit tempted to answer to you also, because I think that your remark was the reflect of what we could see on the evolution of the talk, because it starts with Vincent, which was a very phenomenological talk with all this interview. Then maybe Michael, what was more about psychotherapy. There was a big emphasis on psychotherapy, and of course my talk was kind of a very dry scientific clinical trial. My feeling is that there is no opposition. I mean, I started to get interested in psychedelic when I was working in Marmottan. So I had in fact this bottom-up input from client, because we don't say patients in Marmottan. So Marmottan is an addictology structure in Paris that is very anti-psychiatric, and one of the first historical place for people who have addiction problems. So I don't think there is such an opposition. And for me, science has a role to demonstrate stuff, to validate stuff, and it's a bit like boring, kind of. And we have to understand what is happening, but it's not necessarily instead of having a very deep and intense clinical relationship with the patients. And I mean, for me, even if it was not very visible in my talk, I'm a psychiatrist, and like the most important thing in my work is my relationship with the patients. And it's not because I'm doing some very hard science that I'm not interested in that. So this is just to also maybe to provide an answer on my end. Well, I don't know if there is anything else to say.
I guess that this was a super conclusion, and probably we can thank everyone who talked today and everyone who asked questions and are being there. Thank you very much to all of you. We are living in a great world. Sometimes. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming, everyone, and stay in touch. Also by the organism, the section of that you founded, and the society. And have a good night.